The mop hit the floor with a wet slap, and Tobias' veil froze. The corridor lighting had just flickered to emergency red. Not the scheduled drill pattern, not the smooth fade of a power rotation. This was the jagged pulse of a real breach, and he was standing in a maintenance shaft 3 decks below the secured zones of Covenant Station, with nothing but cleaning supplies and a security badge that wouldn't open half the doors he needed. The klaxon started 2 seconds later, a bone-deep wail that meant hull integrity failure, or worse. Tobias grabbed his supply cart and shoved it against the wall, hands already moving to secure the chemical bottles before they became projectiles. 22 years as a station janitor had taught him that survival started with not panicking and ended with knowing which protocols actually mattered. He keyed his comm. "Maintenance to Central, requesting status." "Static," answered him. Then a voice, clipped and mechanical. "Lockdown initiated. Remain in current location. Emergency response en route." Tobias looked down the empty corridor. Nobody was en route to sublevel C. Emergency response went to the populated zones first, the commercial decks and the residential blocks, where the station's 20,000 souls lived and worked. Down here, where waste recycling met life support, and the only traffic was people like him, you waited your turn. The deck shuddered, a vibration that felt wrong, too localized to be a docking error. Tobias had felt station shakes before. Cargo haulers with bad approach vectors, the occasional thruster misfire from ships learning the berth procedure. This was something hitting the hull from the outside, something deliberate. He moved, not toward the emergency shelter points marked on every wall panel, toward the sound. His supervisor would have called it stupid. His ex-wife would have called it typical. Tobias called it the only interesting thing that had happened to him in 5 years, and kept walking. The corridor branched left toward the ventilation control room, a space he'd cleaned every 3rd rotation for the past decade. He knew the layout better than his own quarters. He pushed through the maintenance hatch and stopped. A child sat against the far wall, knees drawn up, skin the color of winter moonlight on snow. Not human. The slight point to her swept-back ears, the oversized dark eyes with vertical pupils like a cat's, the faint luminescent marks tracing her collarbone like circuitry rendered in soft light. She couldn't have been more than 10 by human standards, wearing what looked like formal robes torn at the shoulder, one sleeve hanging loose. Blood, darker than human blood, almost violet, stained the fabric at her ribs. She looked at him with an expression that was pure terror, wearing a mask of control. Tobias raised both hands, palms out. "I'm not going to hurt you." The child's luminescent marks flared brighter for half a second, then dimmed. She said something in a language that sounded like water running over stones, musical and utterly incomprehensible. Her small hand pressed against her side where the blood was spreading. "Okay," Tobias said quietly. He set down the cleaning supplies he'd been carrying without realizing it, and crouched to her level, keeping his distance. "You're hurt. I can see that. I don't know what happened, but I'm going to help you." The station shuddered again, harder this time. Somewhere overhead, metal screamed against metal in a way that meant structural damage. The child flinched, and her eyes went to the ceiling with a look of pure recognition. Not fear of the unknown, fear of something specific, something she knew was coming for her. Tobias made a decision that would change everything he thought he understood about his small, predictable life. He stood and held out his hand. "We need to move, right now." The child stared at his hand. Then, with a fluid motion that seemed too graceful for someone injured, she reached out and took it. Her fingers were longer than a human child's, the bones delicate beneath skin that felt fever-warm. The luminescent marks on her collarbone pulsed once, a brighter gold than before, and she nodded. They moved through the maintenance corridors at a pace that made Tobias's lungs burn. The child kept up without complaint, her breathing controlled despite the wound in her side. He pulled her through a service hatch he'd used 1,000 times, down a ladder that led to the recycling sublevel, a place so deep in the station's infrastructure that most crew forgot it existed. The air here smelled like chemicals and ozone, the hum of machinery drowning out the distant alarms. Tobias found the equipment locker he sometimes used for breaks, a cramped space with a fold-down bench and a first aid kit he'd stocked himself, because station supply never reached this far down. He guided the child inside and hit the manual lock. The door sealed with a hydraulic hiss. "Let me see," he said, gesturing to her side. The child hesitated, then lifted the torn sleeve of her robe. The wound beneath was a clean slice, deep but precise. Not a projectile injury, something sharp. The edges of the cut gleamed with the same faint luminescence as the marks on her skin, as if her blood carried light. Tobias opened the first aid kit with hands that wanted to shake and forced them steady. He'd done emergency medical training once, years ago when he'd thought about transferring to station security. He'd failed the psychological evaluation, too much history of keeping his head down and not enough appetite for conflict. But he remembered the basics. He pulled out antiseptic and gauze, then paused. "This might sting," he said. "I don't know if your biology works like ours, but I'm going to clean it." The child watched him with those enormous dark eyes and nodded once. She didn't make a sound when he applied the antiseptic, though her luminescent marks dimmed to almost nothing, and her fingers gripped the edge of the bench hard enough that he heard the metal creak. He worked quickly, cleaning the wound and wrapping it with pressure bandages that probably weren't designed for alien physiology, but were the best he had. The bleeding slowed. The child's breathing evened out. When he finished, she looked at him and spoke again in that Waterstone language, her tone different now, softer. It sounded like gratitude. "I'm Tobias," he said, pointing to himself. "Tobias." The child tilted her head, considering. Then she pointed to herself. "Corksira." "Corksira," he repeated. The name felt strange in his mouth, the syllables unfamiliar, but she nodded with what might have been approval. Her luminescent marks brightened slightly, a warm amber glow. The deck shook again. This time it didn't stop. The tremor built into a sustained vibration that rattled the equipment locker and made the overhead lights flicker. Tobias pulled up the station schematic on his comm, a janitor-level interface that showed him maintenance routes and basic system status. What he saw made his stomach drop. Hull breach markers lit up across 3 sectors. Not random damage. A pattern. Someone was cutting their way in. Corksira leaned over to look at the display. Her eyes widened, and she touched the screen with one long finger, tracing the breach points. She spoke urgently, that musical language tumbling out in a rush, and when Tobias just stared at her helplessly, she grabbed his arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. She pulled up his comm interface, fingers moving across the controls with practiced ease, and activated the translation protocol. The mechanical voice that came through was halting but clear. "They come for me. The Dracovari, my mother's enemies. You must hide me, or I die here." Tobias looked at this child with moonlight skin and marks that glowed with her emotions. This small person who'd been hunted across the void to a human station in neutral space, and asked the only question that mattered. "Who's your mother?" Corksira met his eyes. "The Kira of the Lyrathi Ascendancy. She leads my people." The name clicked. Tobias had heard it even in the lower maintenance decks, in the casual gossip that filtered down from the commercial levels. The Kira wasn't just a leader. She was the Lyrathi matriarch, the head of a species that controlled shipping routes across half the known systems. Wealth that made human economies look like children's games, power that could move fleets with a word. And her daughter was bleeding in a recycling sublevel on a human station while assassins cut through the hull. Quick pause. If this story has you hooked, subscribe now and hit the bell. Now, back to it. Tobias stood. His knees protested, the joints stiff from crouching. Okay, we need to get you off this station. There are emergency shuttles in the docking bay, but I don't have clearance for that level. Corxera touched her comm device, a slim band around her wrist that looked like jewelry but clearly was more. She spoke into it, her voice steady despite the pain Tobias could see in the tightness around her eyes. Nothing happened. She tried again. Still nothing. She looked up at him and shook her head, frustration and fear warring in her expression. "Communications jammed?" Tobias asked. Corxera nodded. "Then we do this the old way." He pulled up the maintenance routes on his comm again, plotting a path that avoided the main corridors entirely. Service shafts, ventilation access, the hidden architecture of the station that only people like him ever saw. It would take them close to the docking bays, close enough that maybe they could hijack a shuttle if security was too busy dealing with the breach. They moved. Tobias led and Corxera followed, her movements getting slower as they climbed access ladders and crawled through tight spaces designed for repair drones. The wound was taking its toll. He could see it in the way her luminescent marks kept fading, the light dimming like a battery running down. He kept talking, keeping her focused, keeping her moving. "I used to have a daughter," he said as they squeezed through a ventilation shaft barely wide enough for his shoulders. "Human. She'd be about your age now. Haven't seen her in 6 years. Her mother took her off station after the divorce, said I wasn't stable enough. Too many contract shifts, too much time in places like this instead of the nice decks where families live." Corxera made a sound behind him that might have been sympathy. He couldn't tell if the translator was picking it up, but the tone felt right. They emerged onto a catwalk overlooking the cargo processing level. Below them, Tobias could see station security taking positions behind makeshift barriers. And beyond them, through the massive cargo bay doors, he saw the Dracovari. 3 of them. Reptilian, their scales shifting colors from deep green to mottled gray as they moved. Adaptive camouflage that made them blur at the edges. They carried weapons that looked grown rather than manufactured. Organic curves that pulsed with the same bioluminescence as Corxera's marks, but in sickly green. One of them raised its weapon and fired. The security barrier exploded in a spray of molten metal. Tobias pulled Corxera back from the railing. "We can't go through there." "There is another way," the translator said in Corxera's voice. She pointed to a maintenance corridor that branched left. One Tobias knew led to the secondary docking bays. Smaller ships, private berths. He'd cleaned those bays 100 times and knew they had their own atmospheric shield generators. They ran. Tobias's lungs burned and his legs felt like they'd been filled with lead. But he ran because Corxera was running beside him, this child who should have been safe somewhere far from here, who'd been torn from safety by violence he couldn't begin to understand. The corridor ended at a pressure door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." His security badge wouldn't open it. Corxera touched her wristcom to the panel. Nothing happened for 3 long seconds. Then the door hissed open, the locks disengaging with a mechanical thunk. She looked up at him with an expression that was pure pride despite the pain. "Emergency override," the translator said. "All Lyrathi heirs carry it." Inside, the secondary docking bay was chaos. Ships that had been docked were attempting emergency undocking procedures, their engines throwing blue-white light across the deck. Station crew ran between them, trying to coordinate the evacuation. Tobias spotted a small transport shuttle at the far end, engines already hot, the boarding ramp still down. A crew of 2 were doing pre-flight checks. He didn't think. He grabbed Corchira's hand and ran for it. They were halfway across the deck when someone shouted behind them. Tobias looked back and saw a Dracovari emerging from a service hatch they'd just used, its scales shifting from gray to aggressive crimson. It raised its weapon. Tobias shoved Corchira forward and threw himself sideways. The blast hit the deck where he'd been standing, superheated metal spraying in all directions. He felt something burn across his shoulder, a line of fire that made him gasp. Then hands grabbed him and pulled him upright. One of the shuttle crew, a woman with pilot's insignia, eyes wide. "Get on board," she shouted. "Now!" Tobias stumbled up the ramp with Corchira beside him. The pilot slammed her hand on the emergency release, and the ramp began to retract even as the engines screamed to full power. Through the closing gap, Tobias saw the Dracovari raise its weapon again. Then the shuttle lurched forward, and the bay doors blurred past in a streak of light. They were in open space. Covenant Station fell away behind them, the massive structure dwarfed by the Dracovari ship hovering beyond. A vessel that looked like it had been carved from black stone and set with green lights. The shuttle pilot banked hard left, throwing everyone against the restraints. "Hold on," she said. "This is going to get rough." Rough was an understatement. The Dracovari ship opened fire, green bolts of energy that screamed past, close enough that Tobias could see the shuttle's shields flaring with each near miss. The pilot flew like she'd been born in the cockpit, rolling and diving through debris fields that surrounded the station, using every piece of cover. Corchira sat beside Tobias, her luminescent marks almost completely dark now, her breathing shallow. He touched her shoulder gently. "Stay with me. We're almost clear." The translator crackled weakly. "Thank you, Tobias Vale. You are braver than you believe." Something changed in the void around them. The Dracovari ship stopped firing. Its engines flared bright green, and it began to turn, not pursuing them, but orienting toward something else. Tobias looked at the shuttle's external display and felt his breath stop. A Lyrathi warship had just dropped out of faster-than-light travel less than 1,000 kilometers away. It was massive, easily 5 times the size of the Dracovari vessel, its hull covered in the same bioluminescent patterns as Corchira's skin, but on a scale that made them look like rivers of light. The name translated across the display, Radiant Dominion. "That's your mother's ship," Tobias said quietly. Corchira nodded, her eyes fixed on the screen. The luminescent marks on her skin flickered once, twice, then began to glow steadily brighter. Relief and something else. Hope. The Radiant Dominion opened a communications channel that overrode every frequency. The voice that came through was feminine but carried harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce, layered and resonant like a choir speaking as one. The translator struggled with it, rendering it in flat mechanical tones that couldn't capture the original's power. "Dracovari vessel, you have violated Covenant Station's neutral space and attacked a Lyrathi heir. Stand down or be destroyed." The Dracovari ship didn't stand down. It opened fire on the Radiant Dominion with everything it had, green energy weapons raking across the Lyrathi shields. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The Radiant Dominion's weapons lit up in patterns that looked like living things, beams of concentrated light that cut through the Dracovari shields like they weren't there. The enemy ship tried to run. It didn't make it 100 meters before its engines exploded in a brilliant green flash. The shuttle pilot let out a breath. "Well, that's that." A docking request appeared on the shuttle's communications panel. The Radiant Dominion was offering berth, The pilot looked back at Tobias and Corshira, her expression unreadable. "I'm guessing you two are why we're all still alive?" Tobias couldn't find words. Corshira stood on shaking legs and touched the comm panel, accepting the docking request. "Yes," she said through the translator, "and he saved my life. Remember this." The docking procedure was smooth, the Lyrathi ship's systems guiding their small shuttle into a bay that could have held 50 like it. When the ramp lowered, Tobias saw a reception party that made him feel impossibly small. Lyrathi guards in armor that seemed to be grown rather than forged, their skin showing the same luminescent patterns as Corshira's. And at the center, a figure who could only be Vakira. She was tall, nearly 7 feet, her skin a deeper shade of moonlight than her daughter's, almost pearl. Her luminescent marks were more complex, intricate geometric patterns that covered her arms and throat and face like sacred tattoos. She wore robes that shimmered as she moved, and her eyes, the same vertical pupil darkness as Corshira's, locked onto her daughter with an intensity that made Tobias take an involuntary step back. Corshira walked down the ramp. Her legs gave out halfway. Vakira moved faster than Tobias would have thought possible for someone her size, catching her daughter before she hit the deck. The luminescent marks on both of them flared brilliant gold, lighting the entire bay for a heartbeat. Vakira held Corshira close and spoke in their language, the musical tones carrying every emotion words could hold. Then Vakira looked up at Tobias. She said something, and the translator in his comm rendered it. "You are the one who protected her." It wasn't a question. Tobias descended the ramp slowly, very aware of the guards and their weapons, and the fact that he was a human janitor standing in front of someone who could probably buy his entire station without noticing the expense. "I did what anyone would do." "No," Vakira said. "Most would have hidden. Some would have bargained. You asked for nothing and risked everything." She shifted Corshira's weight, holding her daughter with one arm while gesturing to the guards. They moved immediately, bringing what looked like a medical stretcher. Vakira laid Corshira down gently, her marks dimming slightly as the physical contact broke. Corshira reached out and grabbed Tobias's hand. Her grip was weak but insistent. She spoke, the translator crackling. "He has honor. Reward him, Mother. He deserves more than the life he has." Vakira studied Tobias for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Come, we will speak when my daughter is treated." The medical bay was beyond anything Tobias had seen. The Lyrathi physicians worked with tools that looked alive, instruments that moved on their own and seemed to know where the injury was before being directed. Corshira's wound was sealed within minutes, the tissue regenerating before his eyes. Her luminescent marks returned to their full brightness, that warm, amber glow that he'd started to associate with her feeling safe. Vakira took Tobias to a room that felt like it was designed for conversations that changed lives. The walls were transparent, showing the stars beyond, and the furniture was minimal, elegant. She gestured for him to sit. He did, feeling the exhaustion hit him all at once now that the adrenaline was fading. "My daughter tells me you have lost much," Vakira said. "A child, a purpose. You work in the shadows of a station, forgotten." Tobias met her eyes. "I make my peace with it." "Do you?" Vakira tilted her head, the gesture very like her daughter's. "Or do you simply endure?" He didn't have an answer for that. Vakira continued. "The Dracovari came for Corshira because they want to destabilize my people. She was attending a diplomatic education program on Covenant Station, learning how to interact with other species. They discovered her location and struck. You were not supposed to be there. You were not supposed to act. You did both. In our culture, this creates a debt that cannot be repaid with wealth alone." Tobias felt something cold settle in his stomach. I don't want payment. I just wanted her safe. I know, Vakira said, which is why I offer you this. She produced a data chip, small and crystalline. This contains access codes to a Lyrathi trade account. The balance is enough to fund a human colony for a century. It is yours. But there is more. She leaned forward, her luminescent marks pulsing once. The account exists in a quantum state. It can only be accessed by someone who does not seek to use it for personal gain. The moment you attempt to enrich yourself, the funds disperse to charitable organizations across known space. But if you use it to help others, to build something that matters, the account replenishes itself continuously. It is a test and a gift. A secret worth billions that only works for someone who would give it away. Tobias stared at the data chip. Why? Because my daughter saw in you what I need in this universe. Someone who acts without calculation. Someone who understands that the measure of a life is not what you take, but what you give. Vakira placed the chip in his hand. You will never be wealthy, but you will never lack the means to make a difference. Choose wisely. Tobias closed his fingers around the chip. He thought about his daughter, somewhere on a colony he'd never been able to afford to visit. He thought about the lower decks of Covenant Station, the people who lived there forgotten. He thought about what it meant to matter. I'll try to be worthy of this, he said quietly. Vakira's luminescent marks brightened, a color he hadn't seen before, something close to respect. You already are. They returned him to Covenant Station 3 days later, after Corsaira had recovered fully. She hugged him at the airlock, her luminescent marks flaring gold, and made him promise to visit. He said he would, knowing the promise was one he'd actually keep. Life on the station changed in small ways. Tobias still worked maintenance, still cleaned the lower decks, but now he had access to resources that let him fund anonymous scholarships for station children. Medical supplies that appeared in understocked clinics with no return address. Repairs to critical systems that station administration had abandoned, completed by contractors who'd been paid in advance by someone they never met. He never told anyone about the account, never used it for himself beyond what he needed to survive. And every month, when he checked the balance, it remained constant, a number so large it had stopped meaning anything except possibility. 6 months after the incident, he received a message. Corsaira's face appeared on his comm screen, her luminescent marks bright and cheerful. She'd learned enough English to speak without the translator, though her accent made the words sound like music. Hello, Tobias Vale. I wanted you to know I think of you often. My mother says you are using your gift well. I am proud to have met you. Visit us soon? Tobias recorded a response, promising to visit, telling her about the station and the small ways things were getting better. When he finished, he sat in his quarters and looked out at the stars, thinking about the moment a bleeding child with moonlight skin had trusted a janitor to save her life. He'd spent years believing his life was small. The Kira had shown him it was only ever as small as he chose to make it. The secret wasn't in having wealth. It was in understanding that meaning came from what you did when no one was watching, when there was no reward except knowing you'd acted with honor. Somewhere in the vastness of space, a Lyrathi warship moved between stars, and a young heir grew stronger, and a mother remembered the human who'd asked for nothing and received everything that mattered. Tobias Vale went back to work the next morning, mop in hand and purpose in his heart, carrying a secret worth billions in his pocket and a truth worth more in his chest. That the smallest acts of courage could change the shape of the universe, one quiet choice at a time.